As we come to this time of year, we once again start a 3-week mini-series of the birth of Christ. This year we're looking at Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. I want us to see an analogy that will help us not only for the next 3 weeks, but with our overall theology. All right, I'm borrowing this from C.S. Lewis. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the witch had put a spell on Narnia, which had made it always winter and never Christmas. It was symbolic of death and no life. It was always winter and spring never came. That is until Aslan came back and the spell began to break and winter gave way to spring. Now this is exactly what has happened upon earth. Sin caused a curse upon the earth and death reigned. That is until Christ came back and broke the curse. But I want us to understand how this works. Christ's incarnation and everything that goes with it, birth, life, death, and resurrection, is like the sun at dawn. It is glorious, a glory like nothing we have ever seen, and it begins to melt the snow. But I also want to talk a little more about this waiting period as we go through these verses. The people of God were promised a Messiah in the middle of hardship. They were promised hope when they had felt they had lost all hope. They were in the middle of winter, so to speak, when they received this promise. This analogy applies to these verses because as we talk about the birth of the Messiah and what his name shall be called and what his government looks like, we need to understand that this Christ and what he has done, he is still doing and will bring it all together, melt the snow, and finish it upon his return. Just keep that in mind as we move forward, and I'll try to bring it to your attention. We're looking at Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. Verse 6 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." In order for us to understand these verses better, it might serve us well to look at the background of this passage and what it leads up to. Okay? Israel had had a civil war and now was split into two parts. Israel, but called Ephraim when speaking of the two, separate, when speaking of the two separate, and Judah. Okay, so you got Ephraim and Judah. When we speak of Israel, we are talking about both together. Okay? Isaiah starts with God condemning both for their rebellion and worship of false gods. As we move toward chapter 9, we see an enemy arises against the nation. The Assyrians were huge and are often called the Nazis of the ancient times, and were seeking to overtake the world. And now they were now bearing down on Israel as a rod of judgment on Israel from God. Ephraim was scared that they were going to get conquered and turned to Syria, not Assyria, just Syria, to help them, and then went to Judah for help as well. So they first went to Syria. Syria said, "No, we're good. We're not going to help." Then they went to Judah. But God hardened the king of Judah's heart so as to not help and deliver Israel into the hands of the Assyrians. This is where our verses come into play. God uses the gloom that hangs over Israel because of being conquered as an opportunity to prophesy of the coming Messiah. He talks of the deliverance that is coming and the light that will shine, the increase of joy and harvest, the breaking of oppression and the destruction of enemies. But until then, they had to suffer. They had to suffer in darkness under the hands of the Assyrians. I want to be clear about something. This goes to everyday life. God will use anything to get your attention to start obeying him. He's not afraid to use anything to get your attention to start obeying him. Here, he used the Assyrians to get his people to cry out to God, and he responded with the promise of the Messiah. How often is it that we too need something to shake us up and wake us up to see how much we need God? See, we run to other things for comfort when our hearts are in turmoil, right? Ephraim called out to other pagan nations to seek help from their threat instead of trusting God. Yes, it was good to seek Judah and try to reunite the nation again, but to run to Syria is not revealing a trust in God, but a trust in numbers. They wanted strength. They wanted to bolster their armies. And we too run to something to comfort us when we forget God. Or maybe you just want to distract yourself with something and waste some time doing something. Here's the thing, though. God did not save them immediately. He saved them eternally. He didn't come to rescue physically when Ephraim called out, meaning he didn't stop the Assyrians. He allowed them to eventually conquer Israel. And that was his plan from the very beginning. Sometimes God doesn't come to the rescue immediately, but he always comes to the rescue ultimately. His plan was not to save them from Assyria, but to save them from their eternal enemy, sin and death, our enemy as well. What good, because think about this, what good would it be if God saved Israel immediately from death just so that they could die in their sin? Save them immediately from the Assyrians, but not focus on the core issue of their hearts. That would not do Israel ultimately any good. His answer to their problem was eternal salvation, and so is the same for us and our troubles. So then they waited for the Messiah to come. Now let's look at verse 6 more closely and discuss what some of these words mean. My next point is us. With all that the Assyrian stuff in mind, I want you to see the word for in verse 6. This is one of those words that is just like when we talk about therefore, we will need to ask the question, what is it there for? If you see the word for, you need to ask, what is it there for? This should give the Israelites immediate gladness because of Isaiah's point in saying that this word is, I know Assyria will take us over, but there's a reason why it's not the end of the world. For, or because, to us, a child is born. That's what he's saying. It's not going to be the end of us. For, a child is born to us. Because Jesus will be born, we will be saved in the end. Then I want you to notice Isaiah is speaking past tense. You guys notice that? For to us a child is born. Not will be born, but he is born. As if it already happened. Why is he speaking that way? Because a promise from God is as good as done. That's why Paul in Romans says we will be glorified in the end. Past tense as well. Remember that? Romans 8. This is the common biblical language to discuss the trustworthiness of God. And as we know, this prophecy did come true. A child named Jesus was born. So if that happened, what do you think about his second coming and us being glorified? It's as good as done. That's our encouragement. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Another thing that jumps into my mind is the idea that if the Messiah is coming from Israel, is he only for Israel? The Jews in the Old Testament certainly thought that he was, but we learn from the New Testament that this is not true. Romans 1:16, here the Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus and the salvation that he brings is not just for the Jews, but for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. Let's look at that real quick. Romans 1:16. Or I'll turn there. You can turn if you want to. Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." Understand that here Greek just means non-Jews. Okay, so that the Greeks include us. And first means in terms of salvation history. The Jews were saved first, then the Greeks. Or the message, at least, was brought to the Jews first, and then the Greeks. The Jews were saved first, but salvation is also for all men, not just Jews. Up until this point, the glory of God was seen by men privately, like Moses, Aaron, Joshua, David, Samuel. But with Christ, it will be different. It will be for all men, the glory of God. This is important because even though in this context the us is Israel, everything we are going to see about who the Messiah is and what he does and his government applies to all who believe. So when you look at this verse and it says, "For us, for to us a child is born," you can say, Jesus was born for me too because I believe in his name. That's the only credential. Believing in his name. We are ultimately unified with the people of God because of Christ. I need you to see that God was never the God of Israel as a nation. Okay? He was the God of all who truly believed and obeyed him from the very beginning until now. He was the God of his people. Yes, he used Israel to be his first light, but only those who truly believed Yahweh were actually his lights of the world. The Israelites believed that because they were born in a family of Jews, they automatically belonged to God. But Jesus came to say that no, the only birth that matters is the rebirth in me. You must be born again. You can't just say, I was born into such and such family. That's not good enough. That's not going to matter. It's who you believe in. Do you believe in Jesus? So just as the Israelites were waiting on the coming Messiah and they needed him to come, we too needed him to come and start the saving process. My next point, a child and son. Here we see that the salvation and deliverance that will come will be a human, born of a woman. Have you guys ever thought about this? Jesus could have come to us the same way the first Adam came into the world. Fully grown, full-grown man, very capable of working and taking care of things and naming animals and all that, just like Adam. But instead, Jesus comes as a helpless baby who's relying on his mother and father to survive. It's kind of crazy. What a beautiful picture of humility by Jesus. By choosing this way. This is what he chose. He had the full experience of humanity from birth to death. This way he could relate to us in all things and sympathize with our weakness, just like it says in Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize in our weakness, but one in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. This Emmanuel was truly God with us. He was with us in physical form then, and he is surely with you now spiritually until his physical return. So as you wait on the Lord, wait knowing that Jesus is right there with you in the waiting room. He's Emmanuel. He's with you through the Holy Spirit. We also see that he will be a son. Some say that this is just another word that means human and nothing more. John Calvin brings up the fact that he agrees that when modified by other words like sons of 100 years, sons of wickedness, sons of blessing, it just means human. But son, without any additions, can mean nothing else than that the Son of God. It brings to mind 2 Samuel 5:14. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. Psalm 2:7. Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee. And speaks of the son of a virgin who will be called Emmanuel. This is not just saying that he is a son of a father or mother, we all are, but that he is the Son of God. This is an indication that the Messiah will in fact be human and God. And he needs to be God, right? I don't know about you, but if Jesus is with me in the waiting room, that's great. I really appreciate that, but I want to know that he's in control. I want to know that he's got this. He's not just saying, hey man, I'm in this with you. I don't know what's going to happen, but we're going to figure this out together. I'd be like, what? You're God. What do you mean we're going to figure this out? No, he's saying, I'm with you. I have a plan. Stay beside me, and everything's going to work out in the end. This current darkness that Israel is in is all a part of his plan, just like how the Assyrians were a part of his plan for Israel. Last point, all of grace. This is a weighty, vital part of the text. Once this son is given, the salvation of the Jews and the entire church is all of grace and in Christ. It would have been no good to us if he had not been given. Christ is a gift of grace. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I want us to jump to the end of verse 7, where it says, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Here, zeal is a powerful expression of passionate determination. God is passionately determined that this child will be born and the Son given. It is a huge statement because it is a guarantee that the Messiah will come. Yahweh will do it. It doesn't depend on you. It doesn't depend on your goodness, your righteousness, your good deeds, because none of these things save you. It is all of God. Just like Jesus was all of God, your salvation is all of God. We could not have forced God's hand or begged him long enough to bring deliverance. If God did not decide to act on our behalf, please understand we would be begging for eternity. There is nothing we could do to change the situation. Do you see how absolutely and utterly helpless we are without God? And yet he chose to show us love by giving love incarnate in Jesus. Israel did not deserve to be delivered from Assyria, and no one deserves to be delivered from sin. It is all of God and all of grace. Here in this text, we see the prophecy of the coming Messiah, a prophecy that was made 700 years before the birth of Christ. Let me say that again. This prophecy was made 700 years before it happened. That means many people were born and died in this time period without ever seeing the Messiah come, without ever seeing the deliverance. Not only that, but 400 of the 700 years were in between the testaments, and God was completely silent. The people of God heard nothing from their Lord until the silence was broken by the sound of a baby crying. That's what broke the silence from God. For 400 years, the people of God were waiting and wondered, has the Lord forgotten us? Is he going to come through with his promise? Have we lost complete favor in the Lord? I know he promised the coming Messiah, but we've heard nothing from him. No prophet, no sign, no wonder, just silence. Did he change his mind? Have you ever been there? Did you receive a promise from the Lord that he hasn't fulfilled yet, and you wonder if he ever will? Maybe you haven't received a specific promise, but you know you are saved, and you're just in a period of life where God has been totally silent. He feels so far and so distant. And believe me, students, if you haven't been in that area yet of life, you're going to at some point. You're going to feel that God is far. You're going to feel he's silent. I know this because God allows every Christian to go through these periods because those are the periods of life that strengthen you. You wonder, will he ever come back? Does he still love me? Right? Let me tell you tonight. Because the silence was broken by a baby the first time, our silencing will always be broken any other time if you keep the faith. God is telling you, I have not forgotten you. I am still here. And one day, any silencing will be completely broken by the second coming. If the first happened, the second is a guarantee. That's how the Trinity works, guys. God the Father sends the Son. The Son performs the work of the Father perfectly. Then the Son sends the Holy Spirit as a down payment, declaring the guarantee of his return. Because Jesus came as a baby and lived a sinless life, he will come again. But this time as the conquering king, the Prince of Peace. He will bring eternal peace. One night in Bethlehem, surrounded by animals in a stable, the sun rose and the snow began to melt. It was the dawn sun, and there was more to be done. And next week we will look at what this child would be named and what those names meant.